Thank you very much, Snezhna, and thank you for all the work you've done to arrange it. It's a great pleasure. It really is a pleasure in these lockdown days to welcome everyone, all our members, to this, our second meeting. I'm going to take this opportunity to remind you that the recording video of the first meeting is available through YouTube on our website. We're very lucky in having as our speaker one of our staunchest, longest standing and most distinguished members, Lady Young, who is the daughter of perhaps the greatest, I'd say one of the greatest sculptors of the last century, is married to Lord Young, a British minister and now in the House of Lords, and who is an author and has been a councillor in her own right, and is a very familiar figure to many of us here in the BCS. So I won't say any more except hand it over to you with our thanks for the talk this evening.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. Now what happens now? How do we get the screen?
Okay, well now you need to start sharing your screen.
Aha. No, not that. No.
It's the green button on the
Yeah,
bottom.
I press the green button.
Okay.
Yeah. There we are.
There it is. It's happening. Right. Well, I'm going in the background. I'm turning my camera off. See you all later.
So, well, thank you very much, Nicholas. Hello, everybody. Good to see your faces. And thank you for coming to hear my talk tonight. And many thanks to Snezhna for hosting the talk and helping with me with the technical side. My life actually began as the daughter. Oh, won't move on. What is the problem? Right.
There's a bit of a delay, so don't worry, Aurelia. It's a bit of a delay, you know, with the internet. So just click once, and it will. There it is.
So here I am. My life began as the daughter of the Croatian sculptor Oscar Nemon, who left his home in Osijek as a teenager to study sculpture in Vienna, where he sculpted Sigmund Freud. He then made his way across Europe to London, arriving here when he was 30 in 1936. My mother, Patricia, was an English heiress whose parents had hoped she would marry a British aristocrat. When she fell in love with my father, they punished her by cutting her off with very little money and tried to get him deported. I had a brother, Falcon, and a younger sister, Electra, who was not yet born in this photograph. Our home was an old army hut just outside Oxford, because my parents had no money to buy a house. You can see the 3 children outside the studio wing of the house. Everyone called my father Nemon, so I will too. Nemon was commissioned to sculpt the Queen for Christ Church, Oxford in the 1950s. Whilst he was having sittings with the Queen, he made friends with one of the Queen's ladies in waiting, who invited him to take Falcon and me with him on a teenage skiing trip to Kitzbühel in Austria. Do you see me and all these people down the side? Can we? Sorry.
Yes, we do. We can see 2 photographs.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Okay. I'm moving us a bit. Amongst the party, Prince William of Gloucester, seen here with me on the ski slopes, and here we are in après-ski. Later that year, a teenage boy called Henry Harrod invited me to an event at Eton where I met Prince William of Gloucester again, having a discreet chat. Nancy Astor invited us to lunch at Cliveden House, which is not far from Eton. We ate off gold plates, and after lunch, Henry and I went for a walk along the Thames. Little did I know that only a few years later, I would be living on the other side of the river. You can just see the end of our garden on the right, bit of grass on the right. I had a happy time growing up near Oxford and often invited undergraduate friends to parties at our house on Boars Hill. It was thus that I met a tall, thin undergraduate, Sir George Young, who had recently inherited a baronetcy from his father. Here we are together after an Oxford ball with Jonathan Aitken standing at the end of the diving board. George proposed by the dustbins outside Covent Garden Opera House during the second interval of Don Carlos. I said, yes, please. My brother took the engagement photograph at my father's studio in Pimlico. Nemon took over the studio from Tony Armstrong-Jones when Tony married Princess Margaret. People who watch The Crown on Netflix will recognize the spiral staircase from the next Netflix episode of The Crown when Princess Margaret visits the studio. We were married in Christchurch Cathedral. We are cutting the cake after the reception in Christchurch Hall, with Nemon's bust of the Queen behind us. We started our married life in Clapham in London. George worked as an economic advisor to the post office and was later asked to write a book about tourism for the University of Surrey. By 1967, we had our first two children, Sophia and Jerry. They're wearing the clothes I lovingly made for them. Those were the days. As George had been interested in politics at Oxford, he decided to stand for the Lambeth Council in the forthcoming local elections. This was in 1968. George came home one evening and said, I hope you don't mind. I've told the Conservative Party agent that you would also stand for the council as we need another candidate. I said, I can't possibly stand. I know nothing about politics and we have two small children. George said, don't worry. It's only a 3-week campaign and you can't possibly win. Here are the papers. Please sign them. I signed the papers, as at that time I was still a relatively obedient wife. And there was no time to take a proper photograph. The election came and went. There was a massive swing to the Conservatives, and George and I were both elected, as was John Major. I became involved in the playgroup movement and helped to start playgroups in deprived parts of Brixton. One day, I was taking 6 small children to a playgroup in our Mini when I drove through an orange light and was flagged down by a policeman. He looked into the car and said, Madam, don't you know when to stop? I replied, oh, officer, they are not all mine. At that time, Lambeth, like other councils, was banning the dustman's practice of totting. A little cart was pulled behind the dust cart, into which the dustmen put anything they could sell and then sold the items to a totter after their round. Nowadays, it would be called recycling. The dustmen were outraged and went on strike. Rubbish built up in the streets, and rats started running about everywhere. So we councillors decided to collect the rubbish ourselves. It was my job to drive the dust cart, whilst George emptied the dustbins. no one nowadays would allow a 25-year-old without an HGV license to drive a lorry through the narrow streets of Lambeth. Because of my interest in children, I was chosen to be the Lambeth Council representative on the Inner London Education Authority at County Hall. George, meanwhile, was elected as the Greater London Councillor for Ealing in 1970. We rarely met at home, but we often met at County Hall or at Lambeth Town Hall. A year later, George was chosen as the Conservative candidate for the new marginal parliamentary seat of Ealing-Acton. We had another baby, a son, Hugo, and moved to George's family home in Cookham. The house stands on the River Thames opposite the banks of Cliveden. When George inherited the house, he found it was falling into the river, so we rebuilt it whilst we were in Lambeth. My father visited us in Cookham and asked George to wear the clothes of Air Vice Marshal Lord Portal, whom he was then sculpting for a statue which stands on Victoria Embankment. My brother Falcon took the photograph as our two eldest children looked on. Goodness knows why, but I was still then an obedient wife, and George persuaded me to stand as a Conservative candidate for the local council elections. I'm right down at the bottom on the left. When George suggested I stand, I said, I can't possibly stand. We now have 3 small children, and the present members of the council are all old fuddy-duddies. I was still then in my 20s. The Conservative Selection Committee was very dubious as to whether they should allow me to stand, as the rumour was that I was akin to a dangerous communist, as I was a member of an organisation which favoured comprehensive education. In spite of the shadow hanging over me, I was elected as councillor for Cookham, for the Cookham ward on the Windsor and Maidenhead Council. Here I am in my council robes. Ah, bless. 1974 was an epic year for elections in the Young family. George was elected as the Conservative MP for the seat of Ealing-Acton in the election that Ted Heath had called in the February of that year. Ealing-Acton was a marginal seat, which George won by the slim majority of just over 1,000 votes. As a new Member of Parliament, George walked past my father's magnificent statue of Winston Churchill every time he entered the chamber of the House of Commons. A second election was called in October 1974, and the slogan, "We're keeping young," was used for the election address, so people could display it in their windows. There was a large swing against the Conservative Party, and it looked as if George would lose the seat. However, George's hard work during the 7 months that he had been MP paid off, and he held the seat with a small majority of 808. George then started to climb the parliamentary greasy pole. When Margaret Thatcher became leader of the opposition in 1975, she appointed George to the Whip's office. There he is, standing behind her. I hardly ever saw him, as there were so many late-night sittings in those days. I was often tempted to leave a note for him saying, "The day before yesterday, you came home yesterday. Yesterday, you came home today. If today you come home tomorrow, you will find I left yesterday. By the time of the next election, I had a second daughter, Camilla, seen here with her siblings in the 1979 election address. Margaret Thatcher won the election and George became a junior minister at the Department of Health, where he tried to advance the cause of banning smoking in public places. His next challenge was at the Department of Environment, where he helped Michael Heseltine on inner city policy after the Brixton riots. In the 1970s, the Queen lent Nemon a studio to work in St. James's Palace. It was to this studio that Margaret Thatcher went for sittings for a bust. Nemon is talking to Margaret Thatcher at the unveiling of her bust at the Carlton Club in London. One day, during the time of my father's sittings with Margaret Thatcher, George was having tea with his fellow MPs in the members' tea room when Margaret Thatcher joined the group. Let's see, what's the time? During a lull in the conversation, George leant forward and said, "Margaret, how is your bust coming along?" There was a shocked gasp from George's colleagues, and he was sacked in the next reshuffle. The Guardian newspaper asked George to write a piece about being sacked by Margaret Thatcher. I'll read you a brief excerpt from George's article. George wrote, "Last year, the pundits had tipped me for the sack, and I survived. This year, they tipped me for promotion, and I was sacked. Any lingering doubts about the object of my visit to number 10 were removed by the look on the face of the PM's private secretary as he led me up the stairs. After the meeting, I walked across Parliament Street, unlocked my bicycle from the railings of the banqueting hall, and cycled back to the Department of the Environment. The will to live that enables London cyclists to survive momentarily dampened. Back at the Department of the Environment, I handed over the key to the red boxes, the card which operates the car park barrier, the keys to my room at the House of Commons, and a cannonball which had been presented to me by a grateful community in South London. Farewells were exchanged, and I was relieved to notice the occasional tear glistening on a cheek. Waiting for the lift, I began to wonder what I should say to my wife. The good thing about George returning to the backbenches was that he could now lead the rebellion against the much disliked poll tax. George sometimes laughs nowadays when a politician of yesteryear swears that they were always against the poll tax, when he knows that if only they had voted with him early on, they could have stopped the tax and the subsequent riots. In 1985, my father was asked to sculpt Diana, Princess of Wales. This is a photograph my brother Falcon took of the princess at Kensington Palace just before my father's first sitting. Sadly, my father died after only one sitting, and the princess wrote a heartfelt letter of condolence. Dear Lady Young, I just wanted to write to say how terribly sad I was to hear about your father. The very least I can do is to send you my deepest sympathy and say that I'm thinking of your family a great deal. Words are such inadequate things to express what one really wants to say. But I so wanted you to know how much I feel for you at this time. I was greatly looking forward to my next sitting with your father, and now I will remember that happy hour I was fortunate enough to spend with him. George and the family were back on the stump for the 1987 election, which he won with an increased majority. Every week, George wrote a light-hearted column for the local newspaper. This column that you see was about the dilemma we found ourselves in when we noticed quite large splashes of blood on our French windows. George wrote, "Close inspection of the house revealed more traces of blood on other windows and even on the leaves of nearby trees. Some of it was 7 feet off the ground. Her ladyship thought it might have been a Pyrenean mountain dog that had stubbed its toe in the dark, then asked for first aid. The police came and scraped off samples of blood. Their dogs rushed around in the bushes but found no sign of a corpse. In the end, a policeman who was a member of the RSPB came up with the answer. Within minutes, he'd solved the mystery that had stumped us. Some crows with a low IQ had seen a reflection of themselves in the window. Believing it to be a rival gang encroaching on their territory, they had attacked it with vigor, oblivious to the self-injury they were inflicting." The Green Movement, which started taking off in the 1980s with lead-free petrol. I'll read that again. The Green Movement really started taking off in the 1980s with lead-free petrol. I decided that Cookham should be one of the first green villages. The local paper mill supplied us with an enormous skip where people could leave cardboard and paper. The butcher agreed to sell organic meat. The hardware shop sold Ecovare products, and the greengrocer sold organic fruit and vegetables. I persuaded my father's friend, Lord Charteris, the Provost of Eton, and his wife, to fill a skip with Eton's recyclable paper. Here they are, leading by example. When John Major became Prime Minister, George was made Minister of State for Housing and Planning. One of his more controversial decisions was to allow a shark to remain in the roof of this Oxford house. He said he didn't want to live in a country where all originality was stifled by bureaucracy. As a consequence of becoming a government minister again, George was told that he would have to submit his articles number 10 before they could be printed, as every word a minister uttered was considered to be government policy. George said that it would be quite ridiculous and a waste of everyone's time at number 10 if he had to submit his articles to them. So he decided to stop the weekly column. The editor of the Acton Gazette was so upset that he asked George if his wife would be prepared to step into the breach and write the column. I said emphatically that I would not write the column. Taking no notice, George took to writing the column himself, as if he were me, and it very often began, "And so on George's arm." This is a funny article from the Not Sir George Young's column about the skirt length adjudicators at Henley, who deny entry to ladies whose skirts are deemed too short. I met people who said they enjoyed my column more than George's, and I even met a man who told me how much his wife identified with me in my trials and tribulations. Someone wrote to complain about my column, saying that I should be devoting my energies to the upbringing of my delinquent children and persuading my misguided husband to abandon his mad policies. How can, the letter said, ministers take sensible decisions if their wife burns their food, she leaves their gardens untended, and their shirts unironed? When eventually the columns came to the end, this letter appeared. I am in mourning. Lady Young's column was the best thing in the Gazette for wit, kindness, integrity, and the delight of managing mostly to overcome those obstacles placed in her way by life. She is hard to beat. Fridays will never be the same. Another election came in 1992. Here we are, gathered again for the election address. George was promoted to be Financial Secretary, Treasury in 1994, when Kenneth Clarke was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. In 1995, John Major asked George to join the cabinet as Secretary of State for Transport. Sorry about the quality of the... Shortly before the 1997 election, the Boundary Commission swept away 10 London constituencies, and George's seat of Ealing Acton was one of them. George had to look for a new parliamentary seat at a difficult time, as he was very busy in the Department of Transport, privatising the railways. One or two chairmen of Conservative constituencies asked George to apply for their seats, but he said he would wait until Maidenhead had chosen their candidate, as our home in Cookham was in the constituency. George was rejected by Maidenhead very early on in the selection process. I presume he was not considered to be a true Thatcherite. Then it was all systems go to find another vacant seat. George put his name forward to be interviewed by the selection committees of constituencies in Mole Valley and Northwest Hampshire. My job was to meet him at various stations in Surrey and Hampshire, and then drive him to the village hall where the interview was to take place. Never in the same venue twice. As each selection committee required at least 3 interviews, I could be found on many dark, cold, rainy November evenings lost on the ring roads of Dorking, Leatherhead, Newbury, Basingstoke, or Andover. George was one of the last 3 candidates for both constituencies. Northwest Hampshire chose first, and that's where we ended up. George was mightily relieved as we drove home from Andover, and I was in floods of tears. We immediately rented a small house near Andover, and George spent the next 2 years getting to know the vast terrain that is Northwest Hampshire. Whereas Ealing Acton is 2.5 miles square, Northwest Hampshire is 30 miles long by 15 miles wide. George was still the MP for Ealing Acton, and it was my job to be his secretary at his advice bureau on Saturday mornings. We continued to have our main home in Cookham, travelling down to Hampshire after the advice bureau at weekends. George took over at the Department of Transport when the building of the Newbury bypass was in full swing, and Swampy and his friends were camping out in trees to hamper the construction work. One day, I was at a ladies' lunch in Andover when I received a call from the police to say that the bypass protesters were marching towards our house in Cookham. I rushed back to discover that the protesters had dug up our lawn and left. The police assured me that they had not been into the house. This was true, but in the evening they were seen on the television dancing on the roof of the house, waving their banners. When the 1997 election was called, we started electioneering in earnest. This was the 7th election in which I had played a supportive role. To begin with, I and a team of canvassers put George's election address through letterboxes in the homes of the people who lived in the villages and towns that make up northwest Hampshire. Then, after that, my job was to stand in the background whilst George knocked on a door, asked politely if the owner of the house was likely to vote for him, and if possible, the voter's wife or husband and voting age children. The answer was then recorded by me on a canvas sheet, which was returned to the head office in Andover and scrutinised to gauge the temperature of the electorate. On election day, all the people who had said they intended to vote for George were urged to vote. George was duly elected as MP for North West Hampshire, and we left our home in Cookham and moved from Cookham to Penton Musey, a village in the new constituency. Once again, I settled into my life as a dutiful wife, going to coffee mornings, charity events, and summer fetes. As there are over 60 villages in North West Hampshire, we sometimes attended 5 fetes on the same day. I was often asked to judge the children's fancy dress, not a task anyone undertakes lightly, as you can alienate most of the parents of the children, only making 1 or 2 happy. A couple of years after the election, our pregnant daughter Sophia came to visit us from her home in Tooting. As the day wore on, it became clear that Sophia was in labour. George suggested she should go to the excellent birth centre in Andover. No, she said she would prefer to return to the birth centre in Tooting. It was then decided that George and I would drive her to London in our Rover Sterling, and her husband and toddler Leo would follow in their small Fiat. On our way to Tooting, we took a wrong turning, and as we went into a long underpass, Sophia said, "Baby coming," from the back seat. Once out of the tunnel, George pulled up on the side of the road, and I jumped out of the front seat to help Sophia in the back. It was dark, and we didn't know where we were. As I delivered the baby, I could hear George ringing 999 and saying he was sorry he didn't know where we were, but he thought we might be heading towards Brighton. The story had a happy ending, as baby Alexander Sterling was born with no difficulty, and eventually an ambulance located us, and Sophia and baby were taken to hospital for a checkup. When George told one of his colleagues that his daughter had had a baby in the back of his car, his friend said, "Oh no, my goodness, how is it?" George said, "Absolutely fine, not a stain on the seat." And here is Alexander Sterling revisiting his place of birth. Although we had moved to Hampshire, I didn't neglect my duties of helping with money-raising events for the Conservative Party. I duly took it my turn to be chairman of various balls. Here I am with John and Norma at the Blue Ball, and this is a ball I chaired when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. When Tony Blair and the Labour Party won the 1997 election, George became a member of the opposition, and life was a little less hectic. I decided it was time for me to learn more about my father's roots in Croatia. We visited my father's hometown of Osijek, where George took this photograph of me, holding a red jacket, outside the house where my father was born, which is very near my father's statue of a mother and child. This was his memorial to his mother, my grandmother, and all the other Croatian Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. I was amused to see that my photograph of George in Samobor was the same church in the photograph my father took when he stayed in Samobor with his girlfriend in 1937. I often went to Croatia during the next few years. Here I am on the left, opposite my father's bust of Sigmund Freud in the Modern Museum in Zagreb. Looking out of the train window on my way to Osijek, I was excited when I saw the twin spires of the cathedral at Jakovo, the very same spires that my 21-year-old father included in his relief of the Bishop of Jakovo in 1927. Apparently, the bishop complained that Nemon had made him look like a brute and a Turk. A very friendly taxi driver drove me from the station to my hotel in Osijek and gave me his card in case I wished to use his services again. A wonderful tribute to my father awaited me in Osijek. The naming of the Oscar Nemon Park. I'm standing next to Dr. Darko Fischer with Nemon's statue hidden behind us. In the summer of 2009, we visited Croatia again and met some of George's constituents in Dubrovnik, who took this photograph of us together on the town ramparts. We visited the Vlaho Bukovac Museum in Savtat, where I saw Nemon's bust of Bukovac's son, Argo. This is the view from our room just above the town of Savtat. We went on a boat trip round the islands and came back late in the evening to find that David Cameron had been frantically trying to get in touch with George all day to offer him the post of shadow leader of the House. In 2010, the Conservatives won the general election and George became leader of the House and Lord Privy Seal. After a couple of years, David Cameron reshuffled his cabinet and asked George to make way for a new face, so George returned to the backbenches. But only for a few weeks. George was asked to become Chief Whip after Andrew Mitchell resigned over Plebgate. Here he is with his band of whips. Scott Buchholz, a member of the Australian Parliament, gave George a stock whip as a gift. George asked Scott to demonstrate how the whip worked. They went to a small courtyard in the House of Commons where, in Scott's expert hands, the whip made a loud crack, exactly like the firing of a gun. There was a scream from an upstairs room, and they scarpered quickly before some trigger-happy policeman arrived on the scene. After over 40 years in Parliament, George decided not to stand in the 2015 election, and so my life as an MP's wife came to an end. George's political career did not end, as he was appointed to the House of Lords. We're standing in front of Nemon's bust of the Queen in the robing room of the House of Lords. And here we are, after the opening of Parliament in 2016. George was made a whip and a minister in the House of Lords. George continued to stand up for his principles and resigned from the government over the illegal prorogation of Parliament in 2019. And so my life as the wife of an active politician. George published a collection of all the amusing articles that he wrote during his time as MP. He called the book "I'm Keeping Young," as this was the slogan which was used at every election after the first one in 1974. 74. And I wrote a biography of my father, Finding Nemon. If anybody would like a copy of either book, please email the British Croatian Society, who will forward your email to me. Oh, what's happened? And so I've come to the end of the talk. Something, sorry, slightly gone wrong, but never mind. I hope you have enjoyed this light-hearted look at my life in the world of politics.
Great. Thank you, Aurelie. Fantastic. I enjoyed your talk enormously.
Oh, thank you.
And I was in giggles a lot.
Yes.
Behind the microphone. It's good that you didn't hear me. I mean, a lot of giggle, I'm sure.
Well, I'm glad you did. Actually, I was. It's a bit unnerving when you don't know if anybody's laughing. So that's good news. But
yes, I'm sure. I'm sure quite a few people were laughing.
Yes, good.
Okay. Do you want to stop sharing the screen and maybe we can ask everyone to
stop share. There we are.
Here it is. I have asked, suggested to people to ask questions in the chat or to raise a hand to ask a question. I hope, Aurelie, you're happy to answer questions.
Yeah, absolutely happy. Yes.
Okay, great. Right. Is there a brave person who would like to start with questions?
Oh, well, never mind.
No one? No one out there? Is there Catherine Longworth? Would you like to ask a question? You would need to unmute yourself.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
Hello. Hi.
I have known Aurelia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have known Aurelia for a very, very long time, and I honestly, she just reduced me to tears on some of those. A lot of the anecdotes, I have to say, I didn't know, but there were lovely photographs, and I've enjoyed it enormously. So I don't really have a question, just to say thank you, Aurelia, very much for your wonderful talk. Honestly, it just brought back flooding memories, and I was in the picture.
Yeah,
on the floor of the one when you were sitting outside Pleasantland when we were all students.
Yeah, I hope. So, could you see yourself?
Memories. Yes.
Did you see yourself in that? Yes, yes.
I've got that picture.
Good.
Thank you, Aurelia, very much.
Well, thanks, Kathy. Good to see you.
Great. We have a comment from Isabel Miles. She's saying, thank you for a most interesting insight into your life, Lady Young.
There's Electra.
Oh, Electra. Hello, Electra. Are you going to say something? Going to criticise me, Electra? Did I get it all?
No, brilliant. Well done. And
Thank you.
Very nice to see you as such a young and sprightly adolescent.
Right.
Fantastic. Anyone else who would like to say something? There is a comment from Flora. She's saying, a brilliant talk. We enjoyed it so much. Congratulations from Flora and Eric. Sophie Butler. There is a question from Sophia. Sophia, would you like to ask the question yourself, or shall I read it? I can't see you on the screen, but you're very welcome to unmute yourself and to ask the question.
Oh, there she is.
There it is. Go ahead.
Right.
You need to unmute yourself.
Unmute.
Sophia.
Unmute.
Go ahead.
I'm unmuted now. How did the protesters get onto the roof if they didn't go through the house?
Well, I presume they somehow yanked themselves up. There is a balcony on the house, and I presume somehow or other, or they can get in trees. They probably have all the right sort of equipment to throw things up. I don't know. So I don't know. All I know is that police reassured me that no one had been in the house, and it's true. But it was funny to see them on the roof, the flat roof, dancing about on the news.
Wow, it must have been scary. There is
I do have a question. Actually, if Johnny asked a question, what was George's view on Europe and Brexit?
George was a Remainer, and he actually said it would never happen. And so for a very long time, because I believe most things George says, that it was never going to happen. But obviously, Brexit happened in the end. So anyhow, George was not pro-Brexit.
Thank you. There is a Sally Donati. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes, I think I've unmuted myself.
Yes, you have.
Hello,
Okay.
Sam.
I was very interested in your story. It always sounded as though you were rather reluctant to engage in these things. And I wondered which of all the different roles and situations you found yourself in, you enjoyed most.
Well, I'm quite a gregarious, you can see, person. So I was happy in most roles, but the one that I got most wrong was when I had to give prizes at schools in Lambeth, because when the Lambeth schools had prize givings and they couldn't think who to ask, they often said, oh, well, let's ask Lady Young, the ILIA representative. And one day I gave, well, I always, when I was giving the prizes, wore a hat and gloves, because you did in those days, and left the children at home. But if it was a primary school, I quite often asked if I could take the children with me, because then Sophia was 4 or 5 and Jerry was about 3. So I went to one primary school where I hadn't been asked to give the prizes, and I was greeted by the head, put on the platform, given some flowers. The children were taken away. So I realized I was giving the prizes, and during my speech and giving the prizes and saying how wonderful they all were, Sophia and Jerry, the 2 children, rolled around below me in front of the children, much to the school children's delight. So when I got home, I rang up the education man, the head of education, we called them, and said that was really embarrassing today. Could you please make sure that I know when I'm giving the prizes? And he said, oh, so sorry, Lady. It's a new head. She probably didn't realize. I apologize. Half an hour later, he rang up and said, you weren't meant to be giving the prizes. So giving prizes at school when you're quite young. So anyhow, those are the times that I least enjoyed, but that wasn't political. Otherwise, I really was quite happy. I didn't have any great. So what was the question? What did I like most? Or did I like least?
Well, that sounds as though there was something that you didn't like, the fact that you had to sort of work out what you were doing. I was wondering what you'd enjoyed most.
What I enjoyed most, being a sort of a subsidiary person, being the wife. Well, it's fun being at the centre of politics. It's fun having John Major as a good friend and hearing, now how everything worked and what, I mean, it's fascinating being at the centre, as George was, seeing the friendships, unfriendships. Well, you can see what Sasha Soir said rather cattily. I'm never going to do that, you'll be glad to hear. So yes, it's as you can imagine, well, it is interesting when you're at the centre.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the end of that little bit.
Great, thank you. There is a question from Susanna and Robert Delata. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, wonderful talk, Aurelia. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. But I was really impressed with the wealth of material, archive material you presented. And I just wondered whether you also kept a diary to be able to remember all the detail.
No, I didn't keep a diary, unfortunately. So I just had to, but there are all those election addresses, and we did take photographs, and so that is probably quite enough material for sort of 40-minute talk.
Still very impressive.
Actually, I see that Jane Kennedy is there with her mother, and I was thinking, as I was saying, we put the election addresses through the letterboxes, that she might have thought, no, you didn't. The election addresses actually get sent in the post. I'm pretty sure. Can you nod, Jane, if that's right? I think it is right.
Don't worry. I can remember you and George coming out on various walks around Upper Clapford and having lunch in the village pub. And yeah, we had a great time. And I wanted to say to everyone, Aurelia was a wonderful MP's wife in the constituency. She was absolutely great. And we got to know her very well, and we do miss her tremendously.
Yeah, that's very generous.
Yeah.
We miss you all too. Right. Thank you.
Great, thank you. There is a few more comments. I'll just go through them.
Yeah.
From Charles Jenkins. Thank you for a really wide-ranging and entertaining talk encompassing so much personal and political history. From Tihana, I would like to say big thank you to Aurelia. I loved it. Congratulations. She made some Instagram posts as well. Tihomir Dubrovcic. Can we expect all these interesting stories in the form of a book? But you did mention that you have written a book already.
Yes, I've written a book. Yes, yes, yes. Everybody's most welcome. Anybody who hasn't yet read it. And George's book is even more recommended because it's really funny. So you know, anybody like either of those books, get in touch with British Croatian Society. Oh, Felicity has it. Felicity, what was Felicity's question? She's holding up her book. What was your question, Felicity? I forgot. Can you put Felicity's question up again, or can Felicity say it?
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to.
Didn't you? Oh, you were holding up the book.
Show everyone your books because
right. Yeah, you've got the book. Yes.
You're both so good with words, and it's just such a treat to read your writings. And you know, the whole family is obviously very good with their language.
Right. Thank you.
And I had a marvelous time. It was fantastic. And my little question that I wrote down is: does George want to say anything?
Oh well, sadly, George, who is the chairman or president of the Carlton Club, at this very moment is having to host a talk on Zoom for the Carlton Club. So he was here for the first half, but he's not able to comment now because I can hear him in the background, part of Lord Lexton, who's probably talking about politics.
Thank you, though. It was wonderful.
Fantastic.
Oh,
Great.
I see Julia has said something.
Yes, from Julia Wickham.
Yeah.
Thank you for your wonderful talk, Aurelia. It's so interesting and very fun. The book on your father is fascinating. Do buy it, everyone. Congratulations.
Oh, good old Julia.
Yes, yes. I think it will be full of really funny anecdotes and stories. So I definitely will be on my reading list. Is there any other questions, or we'll let Aurelia probably drink some wine or water or something stiff after delivering this very long, lovely talk. So yes, we should all really clap, Catherine.
That's very kind. Well, thank you all for coming. Great to see you all. And thank you for staying to the end, because you obviously have stayed to the end, because I can still see you.
Yes, we have still very much full house.
Yeah.
Some people are being shy and they are in the background, but the most important is for you to be on the screen, and that the talk has been recorded and it will be available through the British Croatian Society website. So Nicholas and Peter, would you like to say something?
I would. Thank you very much. I'd simply like to thank Aurelia, like everyone else, for a wonderful talk with insight into both politics and culture, and quite exceptionally interesting revelations about how life goes on in politics behind the scenes. I have to confess one thing, is that in 1974, I was on my second diplomatic posting, and I had an overseas vote for the constituency of Ealing-Acton. So I was sat up in Dakar late at night, watching the results, listening to the results, with no television then. I was listening to the results coming in with all my colleagues. And so it was very nice to hear the results at that time. I would just like to sum up to say one thing. I noticed the lady who wrote in about your pieces, your articles, said that they reflected your wit, your kindness, and your integrity. And I think that sums it up perfectly. Thank you so much for a great evening. And thank you so much for being a member of the club and so supportive.
Right. Thank you all. Okay. Right. Goodbye. So we say goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody. Bye.
Amazing.
Right. Thank you for